Hello, Mr. Cunningham. Welcome
Hello.
to Columbia. Um, so my first question for you is, what do you remember about being a part of the 2009-2010 Chicago anti-apartheid movement oral history project?
Um, I look back at it as important. You don't often get the opportunity to talk about the work that you did or the work that you participated in with other people. And it was a formative period in my life. Not the only period, but a very informative period. So I enjoyed the conversation that I had with the young student very much.
What was the first political issue you remember feeling passionate about?
Um, I think I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I was born in 1949, so I would have been like 12 maybe. And I remember I was in a elementary school in Hyde Park near the lake, and we had air raid drills, and you went underneath your desk, and then they had anti-aircraft missiles on the lakefront. Around 47th Street, 43rd Street in the lake. And maybe a couple months ago, I was having dinner with some friends, and I was thinking about that, and I said, "Well, did I make this up, or was it real?" And other people from Chicago said, "Oh, no, they were there. They're not there now." But that's what I remember. I didn't understand why it was happening, but I remember that first in 1962. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Um, why'd you feel it was important to talk about your stepfather and his work as a black muralist?
Um, because before I became politically active, I was sort of predisposed to this later activity because of how I had grown up. I had grown up around artists and musicians and poets and writers, and so my stepfather and others sort of prepared me, sensitized me to causes other than in Chicago. So I knew about Bill Walker's being inspired by famous Cuban muralists like Diego Rivera and others. And so I was always curious about the world in general and felt like I was connected to the world, even though I had not yet traveled out of Chicago, actually, at that point in my life.
Do you think art's like important to activism?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think a couple of years ago, I went to an exhibit at the Art Institute of Walter White's lithographs. And I kind of know some of that history, so the lithographs were more meaningful to me than just a piece of art, you know, which as a piece of art, it was still brilliant, but still it represented a certain historical period. It represented a certain people struggling around different social issues, which I was somewhat aware of. And the visitor to the exhibit, if they watched the little video, they would sort of come away with some background about his work.
Yeah, I definitely think it's important
Yeah.
to have a visual for what's going
Right.
on in the world at the time.
Right.
Yeah. Um, so when you started college, what was your intended career path and why? Was it always history or?
I think so. I think so. It was always an interest of mine, and I grew up like reading books all the time. So even now, since I'm retired, I read like 3 books a month on average. So
Can you describe the ambiance of a political barbecue, like the one where you met your wife, Lisa Brock?
Um, I think we were aware that in order to do political work, you had to have fun too. You know, you just can't just do political work and read and give speeches and stuff like that. That you had to sort of develop sort of a family, so to speak, a network of people that you knew and you worked with and you were friends with, and you interact in different kinds of ways. And so barbecues are a great way to do that. And so that was part of our tradition, you know, to have dinners and barbecues and things like that. And even now, we have about 4 or 5 families that we've known each other for more than 30 years. And we do Christmas together all the time. And we exchange books. We buy each other books for Christmas, which gets a little complicated after a while, because if you do this 20, 30 years, it's kind of difficult, you know, to know what people don't have. So when I visit people, I oftentimes go and look at their library to see what they got, so I sort of know what they don't have. So, and that's part of my, I think, political upbringing. We had study groups year round, and we read different literature and talked about it, debated what we read.
That's wonderful. How did you feel about anti-apartheid organizations that weren't integrated or refused white participation?
I think I said in my first interview, which is still true today, that if in fact in the case of apartheid, the government's part of its strategy was to divide people along racial lines, coloreds and Africans and Indians and whites. If that was a strategy that they pursued, it wouldn't seem to me that a winning counter to that would be to do the same thing. To say, well, I'll only work with Indians, I'll only work with blacks, I'll only work with Africans. So to me, it didn't make any sense. And not only did it make any sense, we didn't think it would be a winning strategy. Similar to if black people in Chicago said, we will only work with black people, right? To achieve social good. That's not going to work because we live in a multiracial city. So similarly, so some of these things kind of apply in different places. Maybe a little bit different, but you know, the concept is still the same. We want to create the broadest unity possible around certain principles. And if people agree to those principles, irrespective of their ethnicity or race, they ought to be included in the movement. And so that's what we believe. And so that's how we even determine which movements in South Africa, for example, we would support and which movements we did not support. And that was part of the basis.
That's great. Can you tell me more, speaking of alliances and things like that, about the alliance between the ANC and the Communist Party?
Okay. The ANC is a national liberation organization. It is not a socialist organization or a communist organization per se. When it first formed in 1912, it was only an African organization. Only Africans could be members. But by the 1960s or 70s, you had Indian members, you had white members, as part of the ANC specifically. The South African Communist Party, on the other hand, when it was first formed in the turn of the century, 19th century, 20th century rather, it started off as a white, largely immigrant organization in South Africa. By the 1930s and 40s, it had changed. While it still had white members, the majority of its members were black. And this is a similar trajectory for communist parties in Cuba, the United States, as well as South Africa. It's a similar sort of thing because the world so-called communist movement in the 30s and 40s began to pay more attention to peoples of color in metropolitan countries like the United States or in Cuba or in South Africa or in colonial countries. And as they began to do that in the 30s and the 40s, they began to attract more people of color into their ranks. So the Communist Party of the 1950s in South Africa was not the same Communist Party in the early 1900s. It was very different. And then also, unlike, I mean, you had a really anti-communist period in the world following the Second World War in the 1950s, but South Africa's progressive social movements dealt with it in a different way than in the United States. In the United States, the state, our state government and its agencies pressured different social groups, NAACP, Urban League, and others, trade unions and others, that we will make some concessions, and this is not publicly known, but there's a lot of scholarship on it. We are prepared to make some concessions around civil rights and integration and things like that if you, number one, make no comments about U.S. foreign policy in the world, and number two, you cleanse your ranks of any socialist or communist. And so, unfortunately, much of the leadership, the majority of the leadership in these sort of mainstream sort of civil rights organizations expelled members of trade union movements, of NAACP, Urban League, and others from their ranks. They did so as a part of a compromise, and I think they also did it because they were afraid. And that's legitimate, that fear was legitimate, because some people went to jail because they were radicals. Some people lost their jobs because they were radicals. Some people's passports were taken away. So it was also a heightened time of great fear that people had. And it was a real fear. But also, they had the same fear in South Africa, but they refused to do that. They refused to do that and never compromise on that. And so you still have, even to this day, you have what you call the Tripartite Alliance in South Africa, which is the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and trade unions. And so that organic sort of connections has never been broken like it was in the United States.
Thank you. What was your role in the Springbok protests in Chicago?
Not very much, actually. My wife, Lisa Brock, was. Springboks was a rugby team, South African rugby team, that was traveling around the United States and the world attempting to play matches. And this was at a time in which there was a cultural boycott of South Africa as part of the international anti-apartheid movement. There was a sports boycott encouraging athletes not to perform in South Africa or not to participate in tournaments anywhere in the world with South African athletes. So Springboks was a rugby team that came to Chicago and attempted to play a rugby match. And I think it was Racing, Wisconsin, it turned out to be. I didn't participate in that, but my wife participated in that. And there were different organizations actually in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs that did anti-apartheid work, but everybody didn't do exactly the same thing. So I saw that as important work, even though my particular committee did not engage in that work. And one of the persons who led that work, his name was Dennis Brutus. He's a famous writer and a poet who taught, he was in exile, he taught at Northwestern in the African Studies program. And I knew Dennis as well.
What were you doing while Lisa was doing work with Springbok and protesting?
Well, she was working with different anti-apartheid groups, and largely in Evanston at Northwestern, where she went to school. And I worked in the city, and I worked with the African American Solidarity Committee, which was a different group. But we all sort of knew one another, and we all, worked together from time to time, cooperated on different things. So we didn't see if other groups did other things. We didn't see that as adversarial or competitive, but there was much work to do and not a lot of people to do it. So that was the work was not the problem.
All right, now we're going to talk about your life and activism since the previous interview. So, how has your activism continued since 2010?
Well, actually, there was some overlap, and I'll get to the current period. But, I started anti-apartheid work maybe in 1971. I was first introduced to Cuba through that work. And what I mean by that is that, especially when we were working with liberation movements in Portuguese colonies, that is Guinea-Bissau and Angola and Mozambique. In particular, we were introduced to the Cuban Revolution through our work with these movements, because the Cubans, especially in Guinea-Bissau and Angola, had supported these movements since the early 1960s in many ways. Military training, training of students who had scholarships to train in Cuba to be physicians and engineers and others. I did not go to Cuba until 1983 for the first time, but my interest was piqued initially by working with these liberation movements. And if you look at the African Agenda, which was the publication of the African American Solidarity Committee from 1972 to 1977, you will see articles about Cuba, as you will see articles about Chile, Puerto Rico, and Vietnam. So we had a broad interest. It wasn't just Africa; it overlapped with other areas in the world, and Cuba was one of those. And so that sort of African solidarity work sort of overlapped with Cuba, beginning in the 1980s. And probably after Mandela's release, I did sort of Cuba solidarity work full time. So I've traveled to Cuba. I actually lost count. I think it's somewhere between 40 and 50 times since 1983. The shortest probably was for a meeting of 4 days. The longest was 3 months. I was there for 3 months in 2018. I was just there in January of this year and June of last year. So I go quite a bit, and that's been my major work since the 90s.
What does a typical trip to Cuba look like for you?
Well, it depends. For example, we were there in January and February for 2 weeks with 10 other people, good friends. Everyone had been to Cuba except one person. So we curated a visit to Cuba to look at race in the Cuban Revolution. Cuba is a former colonial country, a country like many in this hemisphere that had slavery. Theirs was a little longer than the U.S., almost 400 years. And so you have a considerable black population. Somewhere, it depends on how you read the census, but somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population. African Americans, historically, at least in terms of my own experience, working around Cuba, have a particular interest in how Cuba, that had a revolution in 1959, has addressed these historical problems: gender inequality, sexual inequality, race inequality, class inequality, right? So we curated a program to do that over a 2-week period. We did it specifically what we call state actors and non-state actors. What does that mean? State actors means that you meet with official government organizations like the Federation of Cuban Women. You meet with them. You meet with the Ministry of Foreign Relations. That's a government entity. And you hear from them what they think about what's going on in Cuba, the world, relations between the U.S. and Cuba. But then we meet with non-state actors. These are people who are Cuban citizens, but who have independent organizations. So we met with an Afro-feminist organization, right? We met with an Afro-queer organization. We met with young people who are engaged in what you might call Black is Beautiful movement in Cuba now. Natural hair, dress, all of that. And so when you meet with state actors and non-state actors, you get different viewpoints. And that allows, it seems to me, for people to get a more holistic view of what is going on there. Because if you only meet with government people, you will find out some of what is happening, but it won't be a complete picture. So you have to have a mix of those. And I have a lot of friends there as well. Some are Communist Party members and some are not. But the tendency is, if you talk to Communist Party members, even my friends, the range of views is more circumspect, right? Than if you talk to people who are not Communist Party members. Because if you remember the Communist Party, you're supposed to be on a certain discipline. In other words, we debate stuff, but after we decide, then everybody says the same thing, right? Even irrespective of what you might have thought coming into the debate. So it's difference. It's a difference. And so we also tried to portray, or at least to show to people, Cuba is not a utopia. They've done some good things. They've done some not so good things. And I call it a social experiment. So that's what we try to do. And then also, we had a group that did this, and then I've advised high school teachers from Chicago who are going to Cuba, some elementary school teachers who are going to Cuba. And then most recently, I worked on a committee, small committee, that, believe it or not, got the City Council of Chicago to pass a resolution opposing the U.S. embargo against Cuba on a vote of 50-0. 50-0. The largest city in the United States to do such, because New York hasn't done it yet. L.A. hasn't done it, but Chicago, we did it. And then, and this was in January 2021, and then our committee also got the General Assembly of the state of Illinois to pass a similar resolution against the U.S. embargo of Cuba. That was 2-1. It wasn't unanimous like the city council. So that's some of what I've done. And then also, too, I read a lot about Cuba all the time, but from different points of view. I read about dance in Cuba. I read about hip-hop in Cuba. Because when you look at a society through different lenses, right? Music, culture, painting, film, all of that, you get different, it's a different lens. You see things that you don't necessarily see if you're just looking at straight history, so to speak. There are things that you don't even see, you're not even aware of. And so, that's important. That's important. So that's sort of my approach. But I think within this, what I would call the Cuba Solidarity movement, I'm sort of like an outlier. Because I think, unfortunately, they don't see things critically, or they think that if there are some flaws or some mistakes, it's best kept not said. I don't think so. So I want to be open and honest with people. and you judge for yourself and you read. Because most of our movement now, solidarity movement, they don't encourage people to read. They really don't. And I have constructed a reading list, which has articles, books, essays, podcasts, around a variety of issues in Cuba. And so I always share that with people and say, you can visit all you want, but if you don't read anything, right? I mean, your depth of understanding is going to be quite shallow. And you have to do more than just visit and talk to people, and that you have to study as well.
So. Yeah. Awesome. How did you react to Nelson Mandela's death in 2013?
It was tragic. I mean, sad. And I think probably the saddest point was the fact that so much time was lost. In other words, he could have made many more contributions, deeper contributions, if he had not been in prison, and if he had been able to move around the world, move around South Africa, and the like. And so it was almost like so little time to know him, So I read a book while I'm getting ready. Well, I bought a book some years ago and I haven't read it yet. But there's a book about Robben Island and his imprisonment in Robben Island. But Robben Island became like a university, so to speak, right? And so the book talks about the interaction between these prisoners at Robben Island and the debates that they had and classes that they took and the interaction between old ANC members like Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and younger people coming in, being in prison at Robben Island for the Black Consciousness Movement, and how they were able to negotiate that and work together. And that's the book I want to read. I sort of know a little bit about it, but not much. So I'm going to try to locate the book because we have like hundreds of books in our house. So, if they haven't been like categorized, it's kind of hard to find stuff. So.
Yeah, I get that for you.
Yeah. But that's what I miss. And then, in fact, I never met him. I mean, I saw him once from afar. We went to a rally in Detroit when he first came to the United States. He went to New York, Miami, and Detroit. He didn't come to Chicago. He later came to Chicago. Then when he came to Chicago on a visit, I was in Cuba, so I didn't see him again. So, right.
Can you tell me more about your work as a respiratory therapist?
I liked it because you had direct contact with people, both patients and co-workers and visitors. And so it's become even more important to me since I retired in 97, because what's good about retirement is that, especially if you have a little money, I mean, you get up when you want in the morning, you do what you want, you go to bed when you want, read what you want, whatever. But what you miss is human contact, right? I really missed that, and I hadn't thought about it before, but it's a big thing now because when you go to work, you're in contact with all kinds of people, visitors, patients, co-workers, and you talk about all different kinds of things, and you just miss that human contact. I don't have that level of contact anymore. And so I'm more conscious of the value of my work after leaving the work, actually, in that way. Because, I had a particular skill that I applied, which was important, but I think the human contact was more important than even the skill I applied necessarily in my work. And I did that for 46 years, so that's like a long time.
So I'm assuming the pandemic was rough when it came to human contact for you.
Oh yeah. And I haven't really recovered from it since, really, because then I came down with an illness that happened in the middle of it or the end of it, and so I haven't really kind of recovered from that in a physical way. Mentally, I'm probably about the same. I think I'm a little smarter because I read more, but I haven't really recovered from that. But also, it made me sensitive to working in healthcare, knowing that it was unequal and resources are distributed differently. I go to Northwestern Hospital now, very different than going to Cook County or Stroger. Very different in terms of level of resources and everything like that. And so I was very conscious of that. So that's one thing that attracted me to Cuba too, because they had a universal health system that people didn't have to pay, and everybody has a family doctor in their neighborhood, and that family doctor takes care of so many patients within the geographical area, and that's that's important. And then in Cuba, they've trained thousands of doctors from around the world, from Congo, Tanzania, Algeria, Mexico. So they have what they call a Latin American medical school there that has 10,000 students from around the world. So when you're there, you just run into people just from around the world. So when you're in Havana, it's like a really international city. And that's one thing that attracts people is, universal health care, universal education, that you don't have to pay for daycare, you don't have to pay to go to medical school, none of that. And so that's something which is, pretty attractive. It's not much known in the United States, but people around the world, they know about that, those features of Cuba that are good.
All right. So now we shall move on to some current event questions. Have you heard of the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones?
Yes.
How do you feel about that? What was your reaction?
I think it's a good project. I think that what it does is the 1619 Project is American history, right? Like women's history in the United States is American history. Native American history, Asian American history, Mexican American history is American history, right? But it's through a different lens, but it's still history of the country. And I think that's what the 1619 Project does. It says that slavery is the very foundation of the country. You cannot understand the foundation of the country and the different historical periods that we witness in the country if you do not understand this foundation. And so that's critical. That's critical. And so that's important. And but then there's a lot of pushback, as you can see, against this. And what it is that the people that push back against the 1619 Project and so-called critical race theory are really people that do not want an accurate teaching of history in the country. They just don't want that. I was watching an interview with, I think, Steve Takaki, who was on Star Trek, and he was a Japanese American, and his family was interned in internment camps during the Second World War, and he has a graphic novel out now. It came out in 2019. And it's called They Call Us the Enemy, right? And that book has been banned in certain school districts in the United States. What does that mean? Now, this actually happened, right? This actually happened in the United States to people who basically were U.S. citizens. They were Japanese Americans, but they were U.S. citizens. So if you ban a book like that, what you're saying is that we do not want American students to know that we interned Japanese Americans by the thousands in camps. That's not critical race theory, right? Critical race theory, as I understand it, is a legal concept that you might study in law school, or you might study it in graduate school, or even undergrad, if you're looking at different ways to look at how race manifests itself. They're looking at the legal realm, you know. So that's what that's largely about. So when you look at, you know, this book banning, it's largely the books that are banned are books that are looking at race, gender, sexuality. They don't want that taught, you know. They want to continue to teach myths, basically, things which are not true about the history of the country. You know, like the Civil War wasn't about slavery. You know, it wasn't about that. Or slavery wasn't so bad. You know, these are things which are not true, and that's what they want. You know, not to be taught, not to be taught. So, but what's interesting also about this is that, and I pose this to some Cuba solidarity people, and they get a little uncomfortable. And I say, well, you know, we are fighting to maintain Black studies, women's studies, Asian studies, Native American studies, right? But Cuba has had a revolution, but they don't have Black studies in Cuba either. You know, why is that? You know, and people sort of look at me with a strange look, and they don't like that I say that, but that's one of their weaknesses there. They've done certain things, free health care, free medical care, stuff like that, but there are other areas in which they haven't really touched, unfortunately, until now.
How do you think the approach to anti-racism in the United States has changed since the death of George Floyd in 2020?
It's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah.
You have a lot more young people involved in anti-racist work. It's more multi-racial, multi-ethnic than it was when I was in my 20s. And a lot of these young people are very sophisticated in their understanding and their approach to this work. I look at Brandon Johnson's election here. Now, you can say that a number of us from the 70s going forward, 70s and 80s, doing what we call rainbow work between Puerto Ricans, Mexican, you know, Arab Americans, African Americans. We did this in the 60s and 70s, which laid the groundwork for Harold Washington's election in 1983 and again in 1987. And Brendan had a rainbow plan. And many people, my generation, have been advisors to the plan, and some of their kids are activists in the plan today, and grandkids are activists in the plan today. So, but what is about to happen today is much more expansive than happened in 1983 and 1987. It just is. It just is. It's youth-led, very organized, very sophisticated, but grounded in a certain kind of history that people need to be aware of. But I think they're going to do better things than we were able to do. I just do. And so it gives me, as I age, it gives me more hope for the future. And then also, too, I think these people, young people, they will hold the current administrations, the incoming administration's feet to the fire in a way we didn't in 83 and 87. We said, oh, well, Harold, he's the man. He'll be able to do everything. We don't have to do no more. We can just lay back. Not true. Not true. But that's a mistake that we made. And I don't think that's going to happen again. No, I don't think so.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
What are some of your specific hopes for Mayor-elect Brandon Johnson?
I hope that he and the social movements around him are able to continue to build this important coalition. Because not only is it important here, it has ramifications around the country in a big way. So I was struck by the fact I was on the internet, and I said, Brandon's in Washington, D.C. Brandon's meeting with the coalition, the Congressional Black Caucus, So these have implications, because we had similar happening in Los Angeles with Bass. We had similar happen in Boston, but then they overturned that. Hopefully it'll happen in Philadelphia with this Asian American woman who's running for mayor. So you have the development of with local working, or whether it's Working Families Party, United Working Families Party, or the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, got 6 members in the city council out of 50 people. These alternative visions, which I think is an alternative vision to how stuff can be organized. This is an experiment here. I think the city's fathers are shaking to their boots. I really do, because this is just something different. It's different people beyond their immediate control, and so they're very concerned. Because I even watched on not on the runoff night, but the original election in February, and they had 3 outgoing aldermen talking about the election, and the results hadn't fully come in yet. And one of the alder persons that was leaving said, "I'm really concerned about who's going to be the mayor, because I don't think Brandon can deal with the DSA." That's interesting. Your principal concern, with all the issues we got going on in the city, your principal concern is who can deal with working families, who can deal with the DSA. That was their principal concern. So with their concern, really, what they said was really that these new forces out here concern us. We don't control them. They got their own agenda, and they're moving. They're growing. And that's our chief concern about that. So we don't want to see no more AOCs, right? We don't want no AOCs, Ocasio, in Chicago. We don't want none of that, And that's what's happening. So that, that gives me pleasure when I watch them kind of squirm and be concerned about stuff like that. So I said, oh yeah, it's having an impact. So that's good.
Me too. Actually, my first time voting was in this past midterm.
Yeah.
I think
and it's very sophisticated now, because what I learned, for example, I did phone banking for Chuy Garcia, who I've known for many, many years, when he was in the runoff against Ron. And back then, we only had landlines. You didn't have access to cell phone numbers. This is 2015, but now you do. So since I'm having some medical problems, I voted by mail rather than early or the day of. But what I learned from that experience was that both Brandon's camp and Val's camps know you have a mail-in ballot. They text you, and they say, yeah, we know you have a mail-in ballot. They'll give suggestions about where the drop boxes to put it in, or it has to be postmarked by a certain date. And then when it's close to election day, they ask you who you voted for. Now, I lied to the Vallis people. And I voted for Paul. I lied to them. And I told Brandon's people, yeah, I voted for you. So once I told the Vallis people I voted for him, they stopped bothering me. So, that thing. So I wasn't surprised at Brandon's election, because I felt, and I don't want to belabor this point about the election, but I felt Vallis did a TV ad, radio, billboards, but no boots on the ground, no ground game. And it's hard to have a ground game if people don't really believe in you. No way. You can't just pay people to do that. Brandon's ground game, these young people, they believe in, so they do stuff, above and beyond what's sometimes necessary to do. They do it, so it's just very different. It's very different.
What do you think? This is kind of like going back now. What do you think was the significance of the results of the 2016 presidential election in the United States?
That's when Obama got elected?
Nope.
No, what? With Trump?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, old Trump. Oh, yeah. I think, well, it's connected too, though. But I think it's largely a backlash against Obama because I guess 2012, no. He got elected in 2008 and then 2012, right?
Yes.
Okay. If I remember right, in 2008, there was a rally in Grant Park, and he spoke in Grant Park, right? If I remember right, 2008.
Don't ask me, I was 5.
Right, 2008. And it was a sea of people, a rainbow of people.
Mm.
And I thought that the right in this country, they saw that, they said, oh, wow, we got to do something. We can't have this sort of movement develop. And so they, from that point on, through his second term, you have this backlash and this stalemate and blocking, obstructing everything, and then you get to Trump. And I think it's a backlash. But also I think it's connected to other things. It's connected to voter suppression, right? In a big way. Because, the voter participation in the United States compared to even Western Europe is no comparison. Western Europe usually, 60 up to 80-some% of the people, they vote. They vote on Saturdays. They vote over 2-3 days. I mean, it's made easy. Here it's made difficult. Because I think that, the right wing in this country knows that they don't command the majority, and the only way you can get power and maintain it is through gerrymandering congressional districts, restricting voting, early voting, mail-by-vote voting. How many, you can't give people water in the line just all kinds of things that just really openly say that, you don't have a right to vote. Voting is not a right, it's a privilege. Mm-hmm. And the only people that should have the privilege are the people who agree with us. You all can vote, but these other folks cannot vote. And it's very racialized. But some things you can't racialize, like the right to choose, a woman's right to choose. So they got a big problem because white women want the right to choose too. Mm. And it's difficult for you to know which white woman going to vote for you and which white man ain't going to vote for you. So you could say, well, okay, we're going to restrict the blacks over here. We're going to restrict Puerto Ricans over here, Chicanos over here. We're going to restrict students' ability to vote. Even some Republican who's running for president now saying he wants to restrict people who are between the ages of 18 and 25 from voting.
What good would that do?
Yeah. So but they know it. They know it would do some good. I even forgot what you asked me.
Me too.
Right.
I think I asked about what you thought of the election, the 2016 one.
Oh yeah. But I also think too that if you watch major media, including cable stations, they will not acknowledge the depth of racism in this country, right? They'll say, well, Trump won because regular, working class white people are dissatisfied or they're discouraged and they're suffering this, that, and other. Okay, fine. If that's your argument, fine. But if you look at similarly placed, economically placed, blacks, Latinos, Asians, South Asians, who may be similarly placed, they don't vote for fascists. They don't do that. So it's more than that. There's something else going on here. It's about racism and it's about authoritarianism. That's what it's really about. But they don't want to quite say that in a very open way. Another way to look at it is you watch the way the media covered Trump's rallies, right? They generally never pan the audience. They will pan people that are behind him. I think part of the reason for that, if you pan the audience, you would see that 99% of people are white.
Never
right?
even thought about that.
Yeah. If Obama, when he was running, had rallies in which 99% of the audience was black, all over the country, no matter where he went, the media would say, well, this is odd. It looks like you only have appealed to black people. How come you don't, So it's a deliberate sort of thing. It's a deliberate sort of thing that they're doing the footage in a certain way to obscure what's really going on. And so there've been some beautiful spoofs on some of the late night talk shows where they've sent like writers, to Trump rallies or Herschel Walker rallies recently in Georgia, dressed up with all kind of buttons with Herschel Walker talking to the people, and the people think they're the same as them. And so they exchange with them openly. And so even a comedian went to a rally with Herschel Walker. He threw a football up to Herschel on the podium. Herschel called it. He said, Herschel, tell me about the vampires. Why don't you talk about the vampires again? Because Herschel was talking about, he was into vampires. And so they want to obscure who these people really are. And then also the fact that a lot of these folks, I think in the social movement, Trump social movement, are paid to do this. This is a paid sort of thing that, in fact, that they are doing. But it's rooted in, I was talking to my wife, it's rooted in a lost cause. In other words, there were people in the United States following the Civil War who wanted to repaint what slavery was and what the Civil War was about. It was called the lost cause. And so that is being pursued now, So when you look at anti-abortion bans, where are most of those bans at? In the old Confederacy, right? So you look at the most backward policies in the country, they generally are, social policies, are in the old Confederacy, all right? They haven't given up this backwardness. They're still continuing with this backwardness. It's usually in the old Confederacy and in the Plain States, Montana, Utah, places like that. There's a reason for that. There's a historical reason for that. A filmmaker made a film some years ago. It was called Confederate States of America, and it was a film that suggested that the Confederacy really didn't lose the war. They really won the war. So you still had slavery, but it was on the Home Shopping Network. Right? It was new. You didn't have to go to a slave auction physically. You could buy a slave on television, right? So he brought those ideas to the current time, right? And so you see all this stuff with DeSantis in Florida. It has everything to do with trying to rewrite American history. This stuff didn't happen, it's not the way you think it is, like that. So, and that's the reason why all of this pushback against the 1619 project. Because also what the project is attempting to do is to more popularize American history, right? Make it not just something in the classroom, in elementary school, high school, university, but popular projects. So things like this, and then there's a history of a Latinx African American history that has study guides for teachers and students and stuff like that. So you do have people that are trying to move beyond the classroom and more challenge these myths that are here. And a lot of these myths come from films. People think what they see on films is true.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember me growing up, watching cowboy and Indian films and all that kind of. It's just, and people think this is real, and it's not. It's not. It's made up, So.
Yeah. What is the goal? Like, what is the goal with all that thing? All the conservatives trying to keep history secret?
Well, they want to maintain power, and one way you do that, you make people ignorant. They don't know the real history of the country. They don't know who's in power and how it works. I just give you an example. Most people think that the three-fifths clause in the it's either directly in the Constitution or an amendment to the Constitution. I think it's an amendment to the Constitution, not the
I think so
original Constitution.
too. And then it was.
Yeah, 3/5. People think that was saying that enslaved black people were 3/5 of a person. That's not true. What it really was the Confederacy wanted more representation in the Congress. On the congressional side, which is based on population, right? The Senate side, every state gets 2 senators no matter what your population is, right? But the Confederacy argued in the Congress that they wanted the slaves counted as population. And so some opponents said, well, they're property. How can you count them as population? Like, you can't count horses and cows and chickens as population, right? You can't do that. So they compromise. They say, okay, we will give you more representation, but it won't be 1-to-1. 1 slave, 1 vote, right? In terms of population, we will count the slaves as 3/5, right, of a population, not a whole. But now you have a modern version of this, which I was reading the other day and I hadn't thought about. People who are in prison are counted as part of the population in the county in which they're incarcerated, in a congressional district in which they're incarcerated.
But they can't vote.
They can't vote, but for the purposes of appropriating congressional seats based on population, they count people that are in prison, where they are in prison at. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And I wasn't quite aware of that. I was reading, I forget what I was reading, but I think I'm reading a book now. It's called Inventing Latinos, right? The whole construction of Latinos in the Western Hemisphere and the United States. And I think this came up in one of the chapters I was reading the other day. And I hadn't thought about that, But it's a similar form, It's a similar form. That these people are captive, they're not free, so why should they be counted? You don't. It's a constituency. You're saying we have this constituency, but you really don't. These people don't vote. You don't talk to them. You don't have town halls with them or nothing. They just happen to be in prison in the county in which, you represent. But it's a similar kind of thing, and probably 99% of the population in the United States, they don't even know that, because it's never talked about.
Yeah.
It's never talked about. Because I think about when I think about 1616, I think about 13. The documentary about chain gangs and involuntary labor, and because that's all connected. The carceral system as well as these vagrancy laws and Jim Crow laws that they put in effect to force people to back on plantations and be involved in rural agriculture when they wanted to leave. It's all kind of sort of connected. It's not unconnected, you know, at all. But you know, I have a certain amount of optimism, but a certain amount of pessimism too. I'm optimistic because of you know, the United Working Families Party and others. But I'm pessimistic about the two-party system that, you know, I think we would be better off if we had, and it's not perfect, but if we had a parliamentary system where you can have more players in the game and you get representation based on the percentage of votes you get. We have a winner-take-all system. And so it's designed to actually only have two parties. And it's very difficult to have, at least on a national level, or even on the state level, it's almost like impossible to break through. But you can do it in a city like we did here, because Brandon was not elected by the Democratic Party of Chicago, even though he's a Democrat. That was other forces outside of the Democratic. Some people straddle both, but largely outside of it. You can do it locally, but you can't do it nationally and statewide. It's almost impossible to do too. So to me, it's like a mixed bag. I'm hopeful in one way and not so hopeful in other ways. So, but we're making progress. I'll put it that way.
I think that's understandable.
Right. We're making progress.
Kind of going back to American history. What do you think the central themes of American history are currently?
I think the central theme, well, it's different levels. On the media level, on the governmental level, federal, state, and local, it's the reproducing myths. So people don't really understand the history nor how the country operates on a day-to-day basis. Because even though I like NPR and BEZ, you can listen to NPR reports on inflation. You will never understand what inflation really is. Never. I don't care how many times you listen to some economists talk about it, right? You know, supply and demand. You can just cost more, charge more because there's less. You know, So, I think our government on many levels wants, in the media itself, wants to keep people ignorant and not knowing. And also, too, to keep people feeling they have no power, right? Because if you're not part of social movements, I think for the most part, you don't know they exist, right? Because as the late singer Gail Scott Heron had a record, it was called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." So, just as an example, you have no sense in Florida that there's pushback against DeSantis' education policies. No sense, right? All you see every week is him sitting at a desk signing some bill or some executive order. But there is motion on the ground in Florida against DeSantis' social policies. A lot of opposition that I'm aware of because my wife is connected to it. We know about it. She's in conversation with people who are mounting different things. But that's deliberate because you'll feel impotent, powerless, because you don't know that there are people like you who are fighting. You think nobody's doing nothing. Everybody's laying down, letting it happen, and that's not true. So it's very deliberate. But I watch the news largely not to learn anything, but because I know people watch the news. I want to know what they watch, what they see, what they hear, to be in conversation with folks. Because when I was working, before I retired, I would talk to my coworkers and people on the floors I was working on, and most people, if you advanced ideas which would be considered to be radical in common sense terms, most people I talked to would agree, you know? So if you want to argue for universal health care, you have to argue it beyond just the confines of the United States. Say there are people who actually have this in the world. They have it in Sweden. They have it in a number of different places. This, in fact, is possible. Those countries are not as rich as the United States. Why can't we not have it here? Right? Because it's one thing to me to struggle for something that doesn't exist in the world anywhere. That doesn't mean you can't fight for it, but if it exists somewhere, you know, because I even remember when Hillary Clinton was running, and she would bring it up, and they would say, "Well, we ain't France." I mean, that's not a response. We're not France, so we can't have that, kind of thing. That's why I like, to a large degree, how Bernie Sanders argues it. So we're the richest country in the history of the world. He keeps saying it over and over again. So it's not a problem of money. It's how you're going to spend money that we have. Our central struggle, it seems to me, is to educate people in different ways about what's really happening in the country, and what they have a right to, what they should expect to have. Healthcare is not a privilege; it's a right. Housing is a right, not a privilege. I mean, these kinds of things. Even calling Social Security entitlement. Okay, I pay into something like I did for 46 years, and you call it an entitlement, because an entitlement means, well, you're expecting something, but you didn't give anything, or you're not really worth that, So they say, well, we're gonna take it away, or similar thing. Teachers, for example, pay into a pension plan, right? They take it automatically out of your check. You don't get to choose how much, anything. But then the city takes out of the pension plan and does other stuff with it, right? So when you get ready to collect, they say, well, we ain't got the money. You got to accept something less. They call that reform. That's theft. It's not reform, it's theft. They stole the people's money, right? I paid into the plan. Well, they either take money out of the plan or they don't put their share in the plan all these years. And so then they say, oh, the thing is going to go bankrupt. Why? Because you didn't put in your money. I put in mine. I didn't have a choice, right? But so the issue is you have to reframe those issues so people understand, no, this is not a reform. This is theft. They're taking money from people. They put in money. So they think about it differently. And a lot of times, unfortunately, people think within a certain box, within a certain framework, and don't have alternative analysis of things that are occurring. So they think things are one way and it's something else. One response I had to a question about, in the last interview about crime, I heard an interview, I'll just restate it again. I heard an interview with the Minister of Justice of South Africa some years ago on NPR, and they were talking to him about crime, common crime in South Africa, and crime rates had risen. And so he said, well, when people are poor, when you have this huge gulf between the rich and the poor, you're going to have social leveling. So the moderator said, what do you mean social leveling? People who don't have want. they will attempt to get it through legal means, or they may attempt to get it through illegal means if they can't acquire it through legal means, their sustenance, right? So he said no amount of prison construction, barbed wire fences, metal barriers, or whatever is going to make the country safe, right? If you want to get to the root of crime, the majority of crime, you need social leveling. People have housing, they have education, they have quality food. These things, right? They feel secure. Their basic needs are taken care of. That will be the biggest reduction in crime. Not putting people in prison, not dogs, barbed wire, that kind of thing. And I went on to say that you would never hear the Attorney General of the United States talk in those terms. It would never happen. I've never heard it before, ever. So it was a different paradigm. The whole way of looking at this social problem, and it is a social problem, is completely different. It's completely different. And that's what our movement, progressive social movement, needs to do. To have people, give the people the ability to think outside the box, think things in a different way. And I don't tell people necessarily you should think this way, but you need to interrogate what appears to be normal, appears to be the range of analysis. Does that make sense to you in that way? And I find it pretty effective, actually, because I'm a left-wing person, but I don't talk like one. I talk, to me, like a regular person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because many of my frames of reference, because we used to say, well, Mao Zedong said this, right? And that made you a big person, right, in your group, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't say that to a regular person. They don't care nothing about that, right? You have to make a rational argument that makes sense. Now, that may be reference. Your argument may be conditioned by different theories that you've read, but you can't, like what we used to do, drop names. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. That made you very smart. And that meant that, okay, if this one said that, then it must be true. You just accept it. It don't matter whether the argument makes sense, but these people are prominent folks. They're really smart. They're leaders. It must be so. You can't do that. That's why some people were disturbed. I remember when what's her name? The state's attorney Fox, who's leaving office. She's not running again. And I remember social movements in the city. They had protests against the outgoing state's attorney and Daley and all that kind of stuff, right? And so some people said to me, well, these Black Lives Matter people, they're a problem. I said, why? They said, well, they haven't endorsed Kim Fox, for example. They endorsed Kim Fox. And they should be doing that. I said, they're not going to do that. They don't do that. What they do is they have an agenda. These are our principles. And we will support anyone who supports our principles, right? But we don't endorse candidates, so to speak. But Kim Fox won big. Why? Because these young people had set the table. They had educated people. They didn't have to tell people what to do when they went in the ballot box, right? And that's not what they do. So obviously they were a force in this election. Did BLM endorse Brandon? No, they did not, because they do not endorse candidates, all right? But they work in favor of what the most progressive outcome ought to be without endorsing that. They've even done the same thing with Cuba, which bothers some people. There were demonstrations in Cuba against the government in the summer of 2021. I was asked, Lisa was asked, my wife, well, we want you to sign onto a statement condemning the protest. Says, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, partly because this protest is more complicated than you think. If you read the Communist Party newspaper of Cuba, they give a very flat analysis. This is all orchestrated by the United States. I said, I'm going to wait to hear from people that I know on the ground there. I'm not going to sign on to nothing. And I did hear from them. A couple of months later, they wrote some articles, and it was a more complicated picture than what was initially painted. Now I forgot where I was going with that, but everything is more complex than I think. Oh no, I know. What I was getting ready to say about Cuba, and it relates to Kim Foxx, is that the movement for Black Lives came out with a statement saying they supported the spirit of the Cuban Revolution. What does that mean? They support the principles in which it was initially happened. They didn't say nothing about the state, the government. They didn't even say the Cuban Revolution because they thought that if they said that would mean they support the state. Right? In other words, we support the principles in which this project began. Right? And we may debate whether or not those principles still stand today, but that's what they said. But some people felt it was limited. It didn't go far enough, in that regard. So, in fact, Lisa and I had advised, Black Lives Matter put out a statement which was not good. Then the movement for Black Lives was a little different, saw the reaction to the statement on the ground in Cuba. They didn't like it. The activists didn't like it. So they approached Lisa and I said, well, what do you think we should do? I said, no, you shouldn't repeat what they did. That was not good. You got to do something else. And so they kind of respected it, and they sort of incorporated some of what we said. Because even now in South Africa, a lot of us are disappointed, about what has happened. But we have to admit that the ANC made some mistakes. You can't just not say that, even though I supported them. But I have to acknowledge they have made some mistakes. Some unforced errors, some forced errors. And that's to be honest. Because if you don't do that, then I don't think you have credibility with people. You'll say, oh yeah, we supported them, they did this, and that was really good, but they're doing this and this is really bad. Then you have credibility. If you are not honest, you don't have no credibility. At least that's my view. And so, even though these movements and these things are different in many ways, I think there are certain principles which are applicable in different places that you try to adhere to. And also, I've learned a lot from people because I think when I was young, I was very rigid. You had to think this way. You had to do, like that. But I don't think that way no more. I've matured, and I've learned a lot from young people, so I don't think that way no more. But we used to, be very strict. This person is, no. So that's sort of what I think.
Awesome. So, how do you feel about your anti-apartheid activism now?
I'm proud of what I did. Because I think it's important for the individuals that do this work, let's say who are not South African, who did live in South Africa, to do it, to show that you care about what's happening in another part of the world. And I've never visited South Africa. My wife has, but I have not.
Yeah.
And it's also important for South Africans to know that there are people in the U.S. and Sweden, other places, that worked on their behalf. And I think in this other interview, I said that that's part of being a human being. An injury to one is an injury to all. They came for you yesterday, they'll come for me today. and to understand there's interconnections about that. Then I think it helps you to weather the current problems that swirl around us. To know it's possible to win, but often that you lose and you have setbacks and whatnot. But it's possible to win, and it also gives you a certain sort of, I think, personal satisfaction that you made a contribution to something. You know, because we had a friend who passed away recently, and I don't know who did the poem, but the poem was like, "What will your legacy be?" You know, and what that means is, what did you do? What did you stand for? You know, in your life, what did you do? And you really can't have a legacy if you only did stuff for yourself. You just think about it in context. A legacy has to do with your interaction with other people, what you did for other people, and how other people perceive you. Because your legacy is not necessarily what you think it is. This is an interactive process. This whole legacy thing, you know. And I thought it was kind of funny. I was thinking about posting on social media. On social media, they posted the black aldermen that endorsed Vallis in the runoff. They call them sellouts or something like that. And so I wanted to change it and repost and say, "What will your legacy be?" and just leave it like that. And people will reach their own conclusions, right? What will your legacy be? So, in other words, we used to say on the street, "You want to go out like that?" I mean, you know, because even Lightfoot, and I know she wasn't going to do it, but if Lightfoot had endorsed Brandon in the runoff, her legacy would be better than it's going to be. I'm just telling you. You can say, well, at least she, the one thing she did do good, it was she made Avery Young the poet laureate. That was good. I had to give her credit for that. So I won't think maybe as ill as I did before.
How has activism affected your marriage?
It's a glue. Because I think to be married, you have to have mutual interest in a variety of things, right? In a variety of things. I think I gave the example of James Carville, who is a Democratic strategist. He's from Louisiana, and he's married to Mary Maglin or something like that, who's like a Trumper, and I just can't understand how that could work. You know, when you have it's so diametrically opposed your view. So to us, it's worked pretty good. Because I've known many activists of my generation who I've never seen their wives at nothing. I know they're married, they got kids, but I never seen the wife. I even have a friend, we went to high school together. He's married to his high school sweetheart, and she was in my class, and I've seen her once since 1967. And she's still alive. And they both live in the city. I see him, but I never see her.
Wow.
So that reflects to me different interests. I mean, it's just very odd. It's very odd not to be in the same place. None of the time. You know, I ask other people, well, you've gone to other venues. Have you seen him there? No, I haven't seen him there either. It's just odd. So to me, in fact, we were first probably attracted to one another because of a similarity of our work. You know, so most of my close friends, not friends, because I'm from Chicago. I grew up here, went to high school here. Those are other people, but my close friends now are people that I've done political work with for 30, 40, 50 years, for the most part. You know, like that. And so But we connect in different ways. We connect around, barbecues. We connect around politics. Just a variety of things that we do together. But we have similar interests. And also, it's important to have people who will disagree with you, who will debate you, who will challenge you in your beliefs, and not just agree with everything you say. It's kind of boring. Like that. And that's why I used to we don't do it now anymore. I guess some people do it. We used to have study groups, and that promoted that. People would read, because if people read the same text, they're not going to have the same conclusions, and that's a good thing. And so, yeah, that's an important component of our relationship. And I'm her, I'm my wife's unpaid research assistant. When I was working, I was a unpaid part-time research assistant. But now that I'm unemployed, I'm retired, I'm a full-time unpaid research assistant. But it's a lot of fun, though.
Great. What were the costs of your involvement in the movement?
The cost. I think there were personal costs in my family with my sister and my mother. What I mean by that is that, for me, unfortunately, the movement were my parents. So there are many conversations that I should have had with my mother when she was alive about her life, the life of her family, that I didn't, and she's gone. Right? So there are questions I wonder about now. I have no answers, and I won't have answers. So I think I was neglectful of my immediate family when I became an activist in that kind of way. So that's an important mistake. If I was talking to young people today, I would say, well, that was a mistake. Don't do that. Don't do that. So, and that's just one of the mistakes that I made, and other people made mistakes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We did some good things. We made some big mistakes. So we didn't even have the term self-care. What is that? What is that? I mean, what is that? Burnout. What is that? You just quit. You just quit. Like that. So, that's, to me, the biggest, the biggest mistake. So I have a daughter who is, let me see, my son is 31. Oh, yeah. My son is 31. My daughter's 51. So she came up during the time of the height of my political involvement. So I'm trying to, I've been doing this for maybe the last 20 years, actually. I'm trying to play catch up with her. In terms of spending more time with her. And I have 2 grandchildren, trying to spend more time with them. Now, and so as not to replicate what I did and what I experienced. In that way.
What do you think are the successes of post-apartheid South Africa?
Well, I think one is dignity, and that's something that's not necessarily the same as material things, right? Material things such as a house, nice apartment, stuff like that. Those are all important, but dignity is another thing that's important. I thought about the recent election in Colombia, where you have a new government, Petro, and Francia Marcos. And I saw an interview with her recently when she talked about the nobodies won. The nobodies. Right? In other words, we were not considered anything. You know, the wretched of the earth. And we won, you know. So one of her portfolios is the Ministry of Dignity. Right? What does that mean? You know, the value of indigenous culture and language, history. The same way with Afro-descendants in Colombia, you know. And so she came to Cuba, I think a week after we left. And one of our most inspiring meetings in Cuba was with the Martin Luther King Center. There's a Methodist center in Havana that does ecumenical work and what they call popular education in neighborhoods in Havana. Very sophisticated folks that are part of a liberation theological network throughout the Americas and Central America. Right? The first meeting that Francia had when she touched down in Havana was at the Martin Luther King Center with Afro-feminist activists, anti-racist activists from all over the city. So, wow, that's really something. This is a person who's the head of state. But in this interview she had, she talked about, well, I know the people at the Martin Luther King Center. I've been working in this ecumenical movement for a long time, since I was a kid. We know one another. We're friends with one another, right? So when she was being interviewed, she talked about, you know, similar to South Africa. Their material is possible, for example, even if you have material limitations, to afford people dignity. What I mean by that, for example, in Cuba, they mistakenly thought the way that you address racism and racial discrimination, they defined it in terms of resources, right? If you read Fidel's speeches, 59, 62, and other leaders, that's the way they define it, right? Now, true enough, resources is part of the equation, right? So if you look at social inequality in the United States, it will be manifested in housing, education, healthcare, nutrition, in a variety of ways. Those are material things that require money to do, right? And they did many of those things. And so one could argue that black Cubans benefited disproportionately in the country. But they did not put black studies in the curriculum, right? Black people's history is invisible, largely, okay? And this notion that we're all Cubans, in some ways, was an advance by Martí, but in some ways, it's a double-edged sword. Because if we're all Cubans, it can mask differences in social inequality, because you're not gonna. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the last Cuban delegation that came here for an International Women's Day at the UN were all white women. To me, that's a problem. But that's what they sent. And they could say, well, we all Cubans. No. So if they had, in fact, did what the 1619 Project did in Cuba in 1959, then I think that both black and white Cubans would have a greater appreciation for Afro-Cuban culture and history than they do today. That was not, that did not cost money, right? Because you had a lot of support internationally at that time. You did new textbooks, all the rest of this stuff. You trained thousands of teachers. You could have trained them in this, an anti-racist analysis. You could have done that. They didn't do that. So I'm critical in that way, in a big way. And that's why I'm sort of an outlier in the solidarity movement. They could have done that. They did not do that. And that would have given people a certain dignity. So I think even in South Africa, where you have these material shortages, problems with resources, the fact that they, in a way, won. They have political leadership. They don't have the commanding heights of the economy, but they have, to me, more dignity than they had before, and they express that. So it's not just a material thing. It's a question of being valued, feeling worth in the society. In general. So I think, for example, the young people in Brandon's movement feel more worth, in that, participating in that. They feel that they're valued, their views are heard. They know that they are the backbone of this movement. Without them, there's no Brandon Johnson. It wouldn't happen. I just think about my good friend, Barbara Ransby, UIC, co-chair of the transition thing. Her daughter, Aisha, the director of the South Side thing for United Working Families. So wow, apple don't fall too far from the tree. So that gives me a certain amount of encouragement. And you see it in different forms and different and it has setbacks because a friend of ours passed away and had a memorial in New York on Saturday, and one of the leading members of the ANC came from South Africa for a memorial, and he talked about her involvement with the anti-apartheid movement. Some parts I knew, some parts I did not know. And he talked about how his being posted here influenced, the movement here influenced him in terms of there. And he said that they had lost 10 years when they had that Zuma president. He was horrible. Jacob Zuma was his name, ANC. He said, we lost 10 years, with him. So, but I like these interviews too because nobody really asked me these questions. So I get some delight in answering questions that I didn't know I was going to be asked ahead of time. That I still have some of my mental faculties, and I can recall stuff. As if I had been, the questions had been prepared in advance.
On that note, do you have any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to say?
No, thank you for the interview.
Thank you for coming.
I had a good time. Actually, had a better. Well, it was better than when I was interviewed before.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know quite why that, because actually the interviewer came to my house. I didn't remember that, but I forget some stuff, and I asked Lisa some questions in the background.
You got a pizza that day.
Yeah, pizza came in, and then my son came in from school, and it even reminded me of about when that interview had to happen, right? Because my son was born in '92, so it had to happen after '92. He's coming in the house like that. He's probably maybe 10 or 12, something like that. So I'm just trying to figure out when the interview happened, stuff like that. So it's been fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.